pleasure to welcome you to today's seminar from myself, but mostly from Dr. Mike Paulden from the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. And we're going to be talking about value-based pricing. Mike's going to present a novel theoretical framework that he's developed. And I'm going to do a bit of talking that sets that new theory in the policy context, and a particularly acute policy context is the consideration by the Patented Medicines Price Review Board to introduce a value-based pricing component to their processes for determining maximum wholesale price for patented drugs in Canada, which is a very radical step and a major departure from the traditional approach. So welcome to everybody who's listening online. I'm not sure how many people we have online, but we don't need to look, but I'm sure there are one or two. Once we've finished the presentation stage, we'll change the screen so that the chat is visible, and people who have logged on can then pose questions using the chat facility of the Click Meeting platform. So without any further ado, so here's the title of the talk: Developing Technologies That We Can't Afford, Can Value-Based Pricing Help? So I'd like to acknowledge that the work that we're going to present today draws really quite heavily on some funded work and discussions that we've done with our colleagues here in Alberta and in the UK and Ireland. So Himani Pandey, who's a PhD student in the economics department at the U of Alberta, James Omani, who's at I think Trinity College Dublin, James Lomas and Carl Claxton, who've been doing a lot of work on empirical estimation of cost-effectiveness thresholds at the University of York in the UK. But as is always the case, errors and omissions remain our responsibility. And some of the work that we will be presenting has been funded in part by the Patented Medicines Price Review Board, and we're very grateful for that funding. So what do we want to talk about? So here's an overview. I'm going to quickly remind people what the cost-effectiveness threshold is. I'm going to talk about value-based pricing, all of this very quickly, and then hand over to Mike for him to introduce the new theoretical framework that he's developed, and to talk you through the components of that, where we're dealing with consumer surplus ideas and producer surplus ideas, and the policy implications of those insights, and then for the value-based pricing approach, and then the broader health system budgets and innovation framework, because it really has, I think, fundamental implications for the questions of development and the adoption of innovative technologies, not just in Canada, but in every major developed health system where they're operating under a more or less constrained budget. Okay, so cost-effectiveness threshold. We now have a strong consensus within the health economics community that it's useful to differentiate two models of the cost-effectiveness threshold: the demand side model, which essentially is the idea of there being a social willingness to pay for health, which is some aggregation of our individual willingness to pay for health that we express either through out-of-pocket expenditure on healthcare or through paying for private insurance and healthcare. And the alternative model is the supply side model, and that's where we have a pooled societal budget, which is to a more or less degree a constrained budget, and the shadow price of that budget constraint, so the opportunity cost in terms of health displaced from giving up currently covered technologies determines the cost effectiveness threshold. So in the demand side, we have an assumption that actually for every technology that hits that willingness to pay, the health system budget will expand to cover the budget impact. If that is not the case, then we have a de facto constrained budget to some degree, and that moves us to the supply side model of the cost effectiveness threshold. But what's the relationship between these two things? Are they just two silos and have nothing to do with each other? Well, actually, no. They have quite a lot to do with each other, and this is Hermione Pandy's work, developing this understanding of the relationship between the cost effectiveness thresholds. So we frequently talk about the supply side threshold as being K, and the demand side threshold as being V. At the end of the day, they're drawing on the same pockets. If you think that the supply side threshold essentially is a government budget, it's driven by a government budget, so the revenue or the income is our taxes, and money that we pay in taxes is money that is not available for us to make personal investment decisions or spending decisions on healthcare or health insurance, and so as our disposable income is changed through taxation, the amount of money we will spend on private healthcare, private health insurance and care directly will change. In addition, our view as citizens about the adequacy of the government's expenditure on healthcare will partly determine how much we spend on private healthcare. So if we look at the government, the publicly funded healthcare system, and we say, actually, what it makes available, the amount of money it spends on healthcare aligns well with what I think should be spent on healthcare, what I would like to spend on healthcare myself, then actually, we're not going to spend much on private insurance because we are very confident that what we think is worth having will be available through the public system. In contrast, if we think that the healthcare that we wish was available isn't available from the public system, then we have a reason to invest in private insurance, to buy healthcare out of pocket. So if V and K are actually significantly divergent from the population perspective, we would expect to see a substantial amount of healthcare being funded through private expenditure. And actually, we'd expect that to see that changing, to be growing. As the economy grows, we would expect individuals to spend more of the growth in GDP that they have on private health insurance, reflecting their dissatisfaction with the health system, with the public health system's provision. The fact that the proportion of healthcare that's funded, the split between public and private, has been pretty constant at 70% public, 30% private for the last 2 decades, suggests that there isn't a widespread dissatisfaction with the amount that the public healthcare system, that governments allocate to healthcare. So essentially, that K is not so far from V for most people that they are looking to spend or increase the amount they spend on private health insurance. So that's kind of reassuring. Other things that are important to understand about the relationship with V and K we generally think that private sector will produce things more efficient with competition being in play. But in healthcare, we know that the overhead of running health insurance, because of the amount of information you have to gather to run the health insurance system about individuals to know what they apply for or not, it has a very substantial administrative overhead. A government-provided system where everybody qualifies doesn't have to run that administrative overhead. Because everybody qualifies, there's not a question, have you got the right to do this? It's, everyone who's a citizen gets it. So that administrative overhead can be much lower. Further, given that the government provides all sorts of, a whole range of services, not just health insurance, to all of its citizens, it can not only get economies of scale, it can get economies of scope to further drive down the cost of providing healthcare. So there's a reason in that space to expect that government-provided healthcare will be more efficient. The more efficient a healthcare system is, the lower K, the lower the cost-effectiveness threshold will be. And so we would expect, all things being equal, that K will be lower than V if we can identify V. So I don't want to spend any more time really on this, just to illustrate how K and V are related to each other, and we can say some things about the direction of that relationship. And it's really useful to have it set out this way. So that's the background. Value-based pricing, start moving it into the policy space. Now, value-based pricing has been used in Sweden reasonably successfully, to be honest, since 2002. To a lot of the policy world, you'd think the discussion about value-based pricing only really kicked in when the UK started to entertain it as a question. And that was when there was an investigation into the pharmaceutical market in the UK in 2007 by the Office of Fair Trading. And it mattered when the UK started to think about it, because the UK is a reference price market for about a quarter of the global pharmaceutical market. So it influences the prices in lots of other markets, and therefore it matters to the pharmaceutical industry in a way that maybe Sweden doesn't so much. So the value-based pricing proposal came out of the Office of Fair Trading report in 2007. It was adopted as a policy objective in the UK in 2010, and then it was abandoned as a policy objective in 2014 because it was just too complicated, was the conclusion. And there was a lot of interest and challenge about how do you attach a value to innovation. You know, Me Too's are fine, but how do you attach a value to innovation, and how do you think about equity issues? And that kind of, brought that whole policy agenda to a standstill in the UK. And then in 2017, proposals for the new Canadian pharmaceutical pricing framework coming out of the PMPRB included a value-based pricing component. The scope and the operationalization of that remains to be determined, as I understand it. But clearly there is a component under consideration for value-based pricing. I would say that the policy discussions in the UK and now in Canada focused on the implications for innovation and patient access of moving to value-based pricing. And what we lacked for those discussions has been a comprehensive theoretical framework to understand those issues. And what Mike's going to present next is an excellent framework for unpacking some of the issues in the innovation and the patient access space. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike.
Thanks, Chris. So, as Chris said, today I'm going to present a new conceptual model of the cost-effectiveness threshold. And this is the first time that this has been presented publicly. It's been accepted for podium presentation at several conferences this spring, but this is the first attempt to present it. So I'm really interested to hear your feedback on it. So first, some introduction. As Chris has said, the cost effectiveness threshold. Why do we have a threshold? Why do we have a threshold in the first place? Health systems around the world face a common challenge, which is determining which new technologies to fund. Many healthcare systems use health technology assessment to inform these decisions. And an important component of most HTA processes is a consideration of which technologies are cost effective. And in order to determine which technologies are cost effective, conventionally we will compare the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or ICER, of a technology to a cost effectiveness threshold, or lambda. And over the past decade, there have been a number of advancements in our understanding, both theoretical and empirical, of how we should specify lambda. And as Chris said, there are two conceptually different approaches which the field has settled upon. Recent papers have provided extensive reviews of these, so I'm not going to go into detail about these today. What I will say is that a supply-side approach assumes that lambda should reflect the opportunity cost of adopting new technologies. If the budget is constrained, adopting a new technology will displace other healthcare services and forego health benefits for other patients. That's a supply-side approach. A demand-side approach assumes that lambda should reflect society's willingness to pay for a unit of benefit. And typically, the unit of benefit would be a quality-adjusted life year. But everything that I'm going to tell you today applies regardless of the unit of benefit. So I'm going to talk about generic units of benefit. I don't think that everything I'm saying today only holds if we use the quality. It does not. These conventional approaches, supply side and demand side, have a number of limitations. In practice, funding decisions are complex. There are a number of complex considerations. Not all of these are taken into account by conventional supply side and demand side approaches. So we know that funding might displace existing healthcare services that provide benefit to other patients. This is accounted for in a supply side approach, but not a demand side approach. There are implications when we specify lambda for the supply of new technologies. If we set lambda very low, some manufacturers may be unable to supply technologies at a profit, so they will choose not to supply their technology to the health system. If we set lambda too high, manufacturers may price up to that very high lambda, make large profits, but the opportunity cost borne by other patients will therefore be very large. So specifying lambda might result in strategic behavior. If we set it very high, firms will price up to that threshold. And this has implications for patients and manufacturers, and neither conventional approach to specifying lambda takes into account this strategic behavior. Neither approach takes into account the producer side, the supply of new technologies, the costs incurred by producers, and how they decide whether or not to supply technologies to the health system. And that's the purpose of the paper that I'm going to present today. The purpose is to propose a new conceptual model of the threshold that addresses these limitations. And it incorporates considerations from existing supply side and demand side approaches, including opportunity cost borne by other patients, including the willingness to pay for health, which is considered by a conventional demand side approach. The model incorporates the costs incurred by manufacturers in developing technologies. It incorporates the incentive manufacturers have to price strategically up to that threshold. And it allows for considerations of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So decision makers can consider how specifying lambda impacts upon the distribution of that surplus between consumers and producers. And we'll talk about a number of potential policy objectives towards the end of the talk. Now, all models require assumptions. So I'm going to be very clear up front about the assumptions that I'm going to adopt in this model. First of all, there is a publicly funded healthcare system with a constrained budget. I'm going to assume that there is an accepted measure of benefits that patients derive from healthcare. That could be the QALY, or it could be any other measure of health benefit. I'm going to assume that technologies are costly to produce and manufacturers will not supply us a loss. That's important because if we put lambda too low, some manufacturers will say, no, I'm not going to supply my technology to the healthcare system. I'm going to assume that there is a single threshold, lambda, that is publicly specified by a healthcare decision maker, and new technologies are adopted only if the ICERs are less than or equal to lambda. Right? It's important to know that this is publicly specified. That allows manufacturers to behave strategically and price up to that threshold. It's not a secret threshold. Manufacturers of new technologies are protected from price competition. So the most obvious example would be the patent system. But even if the patent has expired, there may be other barriers to entry that prevent competitors from coming in. It may be very difficult to duplicate the technology, even if the patent has expired. This allows for supernormal profits, so profits in excess of what are necessary for the development of that technology. Each adopted new technology is strategically priced, such that the ISA is equal to lambda. And in practice, there are several ways this could happen. The manufacturer could model, in advance of setting the price, internally, they could model what the expected costs and qualities are of their technology compared to the competitors and price it accordingly. Or if there is room for negotiation in setting prices, they could set a very high initial price, knowing that the initial ISA will be higher than the threshold, knowing that they will then negotiate with payers down to the threshold. That's another mechanism that could happen in practice. Finally, you could have a formal system of value-based pricing, like the one that Chris just talked to. Under a value-based pricing system, the ISA will, by definition, be equal to whatever that lambda value is that's used to set the value-based price. So there are several ways in practice whereby the ISA of adopted technologies will equal the threshold. I'm going to assume that there is a broad continuous distribution of reserve ISAs. What do I mean by that? We've said earlier that firms may not supply technologies if they're too costly to produce. So there is a reserve price that firms must receive for their technology before they supply that technology. Now, given the effectiveness of that technology, that reserve price implies a reserve ISA. If firms are unwilling to supply below a certain price, well, then they're unwilling to supply below a certain ISA. Right, so I'm going to call that the reserve ISA. And I'm going to assume that there's a broad continuous distribution of reserve ISAs. Some will be very low, some will be very high. And finally, a simplifying assumption is that each technology is independent and developed by a different manufacturer. This means that if we choose not to fund one technology, it doesn't have implications for other technologies that we do fund. It's a simplifying assumption, and we can talk about the implications of that later. So first of all, let's consider this model from the consumer perspective. The consumer perspective is of patients within the healthcare system. The outcome of interest is the net population benefits, however that is defined. As I said, could be the quality, could be something else. However that benefit's defined, and I say net population benefit because it's the benefit gained by patients who receive the new technology, net of the benefit foregone by those patients who bear the opportunity cost, whose services are displaced as a result of funding the technology. Net population benefit is assumed to represent the consumer surplus from the adoption of new technologies. So from the consumer perspective, we want to maximize that net population benefit from new technology. This is the consumer threshold curve. So this shows the relationship between the threshold, lambda, and net population benefit or consumer surplus. You can see this curve has a couple of specific characteristics. In particular, it's anchored around 2 points, 0 and K. And I'm going to talk about why it is anchored in that way. The first anchor point, which is at the origin here, where lambda equals 0. I call that an anchor point because at that point, it's an extreme point. If we set a threshold of 0, no technologies are adopted. Because no technologies are adopted, we don't get any benefit from new technologies, but we also don't displace any benefit elsewhere. So the net population benefit from new technologies is 0, right? That's an anchor point. We know that we're at 0 at that, where lambda equals 0. K, which is the supply side threshold, is another anchor point. If we set a threshold of K, then some new technologies will be adopted because their manufacturers have a reserve ISA lower than K. So they will choose to supply that technology to the healthcare system. They will also price it strategically so that the ISA equals K, right? By whatever mechanism that works, value-based pricing, negotiation. According to some process, the ISA will equal K. What does that mean? Well, first of all, what is K? If K is £13,000 per quali, which is what the estimate in the UK was, that means every £13,000 spent on a new technology displaces one quali. Well, if you set lambda equal to K, so if you say our threshold is £13,000 per quali, firms will price up to that. Every £13,000 you spend on a new technology will gain you a quali, and it will displace a quali. Every quali we gain will be displaced. And the same is true regardless of the unit of benefit. So K is actually an anchor point. K is special because if you set your threshold equal to K, every unit of benefit you gain is exactly offset by a unit of benefit foregone. So the net population benefit is 0. Now, what happens in between? Why does it go up and down in between those two anchor points? I'd like you to think about setting a threshold somewhere between 0 and K, and then a marginal increase in the threshold. What would happen if there was a marginal increase from lambda 1 to lambda 2? Well, 2 effects. The first is that new technologies that have a reserve ISA between lambda 1 and lambda 2 will now be supplied to the healthcare system. They weren't before, but now you've marginally increased the threshold, these technologies will now be supplied. They will be strategically priced up to lambda 2. Now, if lambda 2 is below the threshold, so if there's a marginal increase in the threshold from here, lambda 1, to here, lambda 2, this is below K. Because it's below K, more health will be gained from those technologies that are now supplied than will be displaced. It's a good thing that those technologies are now supplied. Right? So this is a good thing. The fact that if you increase the threshold, new technologies are applied that provide more benefit than is displaced. So net population benefit is increased as a result of this. Note that this only happens up to K. If you increase the threshold above K, sure, new technology will be supplied, but they will displace more health than they gain. So this beneficial effect only applies when you have a threshold below K. But there's a second effect. When you increase lambda from lambda 1 to lambda 2, all of those technologies that would have been supplied anyway at lambda 1, because there's going to be a strategic increase in their price. There's going to be no gain from this. They would have been supplied anyway. They're just priced higher, and the displacement is greater. So as a result of the strategic pricing of technologies that would have been supplied anyway, we have diminished net population benefit. And whether net population benefit increases or decreases following an increase in the threshold depends on those two effects. Does the first one outweigh the second? Do we get more benefit from new technologies being provided than we lose from other technologies being priced higher? Now, that first effect will tend to diminish as the threshold increases. As I said, once the threshold increases up to K, those new technologies being supplied are going to be priced up to K. We don't get any benefit from those, any net benefit from those technologies being supplied. Once the threshold is above K, we actually have negative net benefit from new technologies being supplied. So that's a diminishing benefit. The second effect, the negative effect of strategic pricing, increases as lambda increases. As we increase lambda, more and more technologies are adopted. And as we increase lambda further, we have this cumulative effect of all these technologies being priced up to the threshold. So the second effect increases as lambda increases, and eventually it will exceed the first effect. The negative implications of the second effect exceed the positive implications of the first. At that point, the threshold curve begins to fall. So this is why we have a peak. And lambda c is the threshold corresponding to the peak of this curve. And it will fall until the threshold is equal to K, which is an anchor point, as I've said already. At K, several technologies are adopted, that's good, but they're all priced up to K. Every quali in is a quali out. So there is no net population benefit. And beyond K, both of those effects I described act to diminish net population benefit. As you raise the threshold further beyond K, new technologies are supplied, but they're priced up to a threshold higher than K. They diminish more health than they gain. And every other technology is priced even higher. It's a double whammy. Right, so above K, unambiguously, this threshold curve will fall further. So that's the consumer perspective. What about the producer perspective? So the producer perspective is that of manufacturers of new technologies supplied to the healthcare system. The outcome of interest here is the profit arising to these manufacturers. And the profit arising to manufacturers that supply new technology to the health system is assumed to represent the producer surplus from the adoption of new technologies. How do we determine that profit? Well, manufacturer profit is determined by the costs of producing new technologies, so the R&D costs, but also the manufacturing costs of new technologies, and the revenues that they get from supplying the healthcare system. Each manufacturer is assumed to be unwilling to supply at a loss. So there's a minimum reserve price, as I mentioned earlier, and hence a reserve ISA at which they will supply new technology. If the threshold exceeds this reserve ISA, then the new technology will be supplied. The manufacturer will strategically price up to Lambda, and they will make profits. Right, so that's a good thing for these manufacturers. If, in the special case, Lambda exactly equals the reserve price, then the manufacturer will supply the technology, but because they can't strategically increase their price, they don't make a profit. They don't make a super normal profit, just enough to meet their costs. They also won't make a loss. If a manufacturer develops a technology with a reserve ISA above Lambda, well, this is a technology where, in order to adopt it, we would have to increase the threshold to the extent that we're diminishing population health. Right? This technology will not be adopted. It is not of value to the healthcare system. In this case, the manufacturer is not a supplier to the healthcare system. Right? That technology is not supplied and it's not adopted. And the profits and losses of non-suppliers are not considered within the model that I've presented. And we can consider the implications of that later. So this is the producer threshold curve. So this shows the relationship between the threshold and manufacturer profit or producer surplus. And you can see that there's one anchor point here where the threshold is equal to 0. At this point, no technologies are adopted, so there's no profit. As you increase Lambda, we again have two effects. Both of them act to increase profit. So the first is that new technologies will be supplied. And of course, those technologies will be priced up to whatever the threshold is. There will be profits arising to manufacturers. The second is, as you increase the threshold, those technologies that would have been supplied at a lower threshold are still going to be supplied, but at a higher price. Firms were already making profits. Now they can make even greater profits. Right? So as you increase Lambda, profits unambiguously increase. Now we'll combine those two perspectives, the consumer perspective and the business perspective. One thing to bear in mind is that we have these on different metrics. We had the consumer perspective in terms of units of benefit, quality or some other measure, and producer perspective in terms of dollars, profit. Right? So in order to combine them, we need to measure both on a common metric. How do we do this? We could convert consumer surplus into producer surplus, convert it into dollars. We could convert the producer surplus into units of benefit. Right? Which way around we do it is immaterial. The critical thing is that we need some appropriate conversion rate to do it. This is where the demand side threshold comes in. This is what the demand side threshold is. It is an estimate of the monetary value of a unit of benefit. And we call that V, as Chris said. So we denote the demand side threshold as V. So here is the two combined perspectives. Note that I've not assumed any particular conversion rate. I've actually plotted these on different axes. So the green line, the consumer line, is plotted on the axis on the left. The blue line, the producer line, is on the axis on the right. And I've not made any assumptions about the scale of these lines, because I don't read anything into the fact that at any given threshold, the blue line is lower than the green. It might not be once we convert them into a common metric. Okay? What is important is that you can see that for certain thresholds, either both are positive or one is positive and the other isn't. And this is very important for policy. Let's consider some policy objectives. It's not for me to say what the policy objective should be. It's for policymakers to say what the policy objective should be. But I think it's informative to consider some potential objectives. So here's a simple enough objective: maximize consumer surplus. If that's the case, then we should have a threshold equal to lambda C. Note that this is lower than K, which is what's advocated by a supply side threshold. And for the reasons that Chris said, a conventional demand side threshold is typically higher than a conventional supply side threshold. So both of those conventional approaches overstate what the threshold ought to be if the objective is to maximize consumer surplus. Right? What about if the objective is to maximize producer surplus? Well, this producer surplus curve just keeps on rising. So you'd want an infinitely high threshold if that was your objective, to maximize producer surplus. Now, what's the potential issue with this? Well, the consumer threshold curve becomes negative above K. So with an infinitely high threshold, consumer surplus is going to be very negative. And that's a possible concern for policymakers. Consumer surplus is negative if producer surplus is maximized. So maybe we want a more nuanced objective. How about maximize producer surplus subject to the constraint that neither is negative? Right? There's an objective. Well, now we want to maximize the blue curve subject to the green curve not being negative. So K is our threshold. those of you familiar with the literature will know that the supply side threshold K is often proposed as the threshold that maximizes population health. You'll see that language all the time. It's not. The threshold that maximizes population health is lambda C. K would be compatible with an objective of maximizing profit subject to a constraint that population health can't be diminished, which is a far cry from maximizing population health. Now, the flip side of this objective would be maximize consumer surplus, subject to neither being negative. Now, this is the same as the first objective, because when we maximize consumer surplus, producer surplus is actually positive. So again, we would have a threshold of lambda C. Now, as I said, you can't read too much into the scales of these two, right? They're on a different scale, but there may be concern as a given exchange rate, as a specific conversion rate, there might be a concern that producer surplus is an insufficient proportion of the total surplus, right? There could be that concern, but consumer surplus is getting all this, producers only getting that. Okay, well, that's a potential concern, that producer surplus may comprise a small proportion of the combined surplus. So we could make an even more nuanced objective. We could say, maximize consumer surplus, subject to producer surplus comprising a guaranteed proportion of the combined surplus, and also subject to each being non-negative. That's a potential objective. In this case, we might wish for a threshold to be higher than lambda C. At lambda C, the producer surplus was not considered to be a sufficient proportion of the total. Well, as we increase the threshold, producer surplus increases, consumer surplus diminishes. So at some point, you're going to reach your desired proportion. Of course, once you get to K, consumer surplus is now 0. It's a 0 proportion of the total. So your optimal threshold under this objective is somewhere between lambda C and K. Now, the flip side of this would be maximize producer surplus subject to consumer surplus comprising a guaranteed proportion. Okay, so when you would maximize producer surplus, but of course, the proportion of this consumer surplus will diminish after lambda C. It might be that even at lambda C, you consider consumer surplus to be an insufficient proportion of the total. That would justify going below lambda C. Now, there's another concern. So far, we've just been focusing on maximizing one or the other. Maximize consumer, perhaps subject to some constraints. Maximize producer surplus, perhaps subject to constraints. What if the policymaker doesn't want to maximize either? They want to maximize the combined surplus. In this case, the threshold will unambiguously be greater than lambda C. Why? Because both increase up to lambda C. So for those of you who know about the Laffer curve, right, in economics, that looks at a tax rate and the tax revenue, and the theory is you don't want to go above the peak of the Laffer curve because you're not going to get any more revenue, right? Think of this a little bit like a Laffer curve. There's no reason to have a threshold below the peak of the consumer threshold curve. There's no reason, because if you increase the threshold, both will increase. So this is the minimum threshold, lambda C, that you should consider here. You could, in principle, have an infinitely high threshold here, depending on how you scale producer surplus relative to consumer surplus. But of course, if you go above K, consumer surplus is negative. So the final objective I'm going to consider is where you wish to maximize the combined surplus, subject to each being non-negative. And of course, you're then limited by K. You can't go above K because consumer surplus is negative. So you're in this space again between lambda C and K. So the optimal threshold depends critically upon the policy objective. Neither of those conventional approaches to specifying a threshold is appropriate. That's not to say they're useless. Both provide important information. A conventional supply side approach tells us that second anchor point. Right? A conventional supply side approach gives us K, which is critical to understanding the shape of the consumer threshold curve. A conventional demand side approach gives us that conversion rate between consumer surplus and producer surplus. Both are important. So those who say, well, we should adopt a supply side approach, demand side approach is not relevant because it doesn't consider opportunity cost. They're both relevant. Neither gives us the full story. So as I said, conventional demand threshold is certainly not irrelevant. Future empirical research, which to date, we're still at quite an early stage in empirical research. There's only a few countries that have estimated a supply side threshold, K. We still need that. We need to know what K is in order to understand the shape of that consumer threshold curve. But that's not all we need. We also need to understand V. and we need to decide what methods are appropriate to understand V, we also need to understand the shapes of those curves. Where is lambda C? Depends on the shape of that consumer threshold curve. What determines that? Well, the reserve prices and the reserve ISAs. Do we have perfect information on them? Absolutely not. So we need more empirical research into that. So there are implications from this work for policy, for theory, and for future empirical research. And I'll hand back to Chris to wrap things up.
Thanks, Mike. So just pop it back up. Okay. No worries. Actually, you can take it off again. I think I want to draw on the question that this brings most acutely is when we look at the existing empirical estimates for the supply side for K, they are consistently lower than V, and they are quite consistently lower than the threshold values that decision makers have been using in practice. If the empirical work going on in other countries, and indeed some empirical work going on in Canada, confirms that our thresholds, our empirical thresholds, K, are lower than what we've been working on in our reimbursement decisions with CADTH or within each province, then what we're saying is the healthcare budgets are not sufficient for us to adopt many of the new technologies at the prices they're bringing to market. So that gives rise to two questions. One, is the reserve ISA really where the companies are telling us it is? And if it is, then actually, when we say as societies, as health systems, that we want innovation, that we want these new products to be developed, but we don't follow through with health budgets that reflect that demand, are we telling the truth? Or are we telling ourselves stories about what we'd like to be true? Do we as societies need to wrestle genuinely with the question of our willingness to pay for new improvements in health and healthcare, and thinking about how that should be reflected in our healthcare system budgets? Because if we're not willing to see that expansion in the budgets, then it would be better for society if the money that's currently invested in those health R&D processes were invested elsewhere, where we were more confident that our values would actually lead to us paying for those technologies that were delivered. So we have a very stark, or we potentially have a very stark divergence between our stated and our revealed preference for health improvements at the moment. And it's not sustainable for us to continue living with that divergence. So how do we square that circle? And that's, I think, the most powerful challenge in the real policy world of Mike's new framework and the insights that it gives us into the nature of the decisions when you're attempting to do value-based pricing and value-based reimbursement. So, questions? Any questions in the room? If people online want to use the chat function, we'll look there as well. Please, Don.
I think you're right that it's of use for the PMPRB, and the challenge would be, first of all, specifying K, because there has been a lack of solid empirical research in Canada so far. As Chris said, there is some ongoing work, but we do not have a really robust estimate of K at the present moment. The second is understanding how much lower you would need to go to get the consumer surplus maximizing threshold. Right? You need to understand reserve prices of manufacture. I don't think we do. I don't know if the PMPRB is in a position to compel that sort of information. I don't know. So that would be the question about how much can we understand about that consumer threshold curve. There's also the overarching question of what is the objective? What is the policy objective the PMPRB would adopt? Is it maximize consumer or maximize producer or maximize one subject or one of the others not being negative, or is it maximize the combined surplus? You know, what is it? And the threshold depends on each of those. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. So this model I presented is simplistic. I set a number of assumptions up at the beginning. I've assumed that it's a small closed economy. Of course, in the real world, if the price set in one country is used as a reference price in other countries, a manufacturer may not be willing to supply technology, even if it's profitable. Right, so there's that to wrestle with. Well, the reason you would care to some extent, even if you didn't care about profits, you only care about consumer surplus. As we could see on the threshold curve, were we able to go back a couple of slides? Can I go back? Or just do the one where we have the curve. Yeah, that will do. Yeah, so on this slide, you can see that even if you don't care less about profits, you wouldn't want to set a threshold so low, so below lambda C, where enough manufacturers are saying, no, I'm not going to launch my product. That's actually detrimental to everybody. So if you've got a threshold that low, it's in your interest as consumers to increase your threshold to lambda C, because you will gain more from having more suppliers launch their products than you will lose from those existing suppliers pricing up to the threshold. That's only true up to lambda C. So you would care about what those reserve prices are and what those reserve ICEs are. Yeah. Sorry.
There's also an issue of this is a way we can signal to industry about unmet needs, because essentially producer surplus, that's their supernormal profits, and when a company is able to earn supernormal profits, it attracts other investors. It says this is an area where we have a priority. This type of technology is a priority. Please invest in trying to produce it. So producer surplus is an important signaling mechanism for healthcare systems to the R&D ecosystem to say, these are the things that we want to see that we don't currently have. Okay, so that's it's important. So that Lang, has Canada decided on an ISO threshold? I would say Canada has not decided on an ISO threshold. We have, by convention, people have talked about the $50,000 per quality threshold, and in the cancer space, by consensus, but not on any empirical basis, there's been references to $100,000 per quality as a threshold, but no, there is not an agreement about a Canadian threshold, nor evidence currently to say what it should be. Am I right in that, Mike?
Yeah, that's right. The second part of the question is about co-development of technologies to reduce the cost of introduction. So there is an interesting point to be made here that there could be gains to society by lowering the cost of developing new technologies. So think about what would determine the shape of this consumer threshold curve. If you could reduce the cost of developing new technologies, that will generally lower reserve ICEs. It will lower lower the reserve prices, lower reserve ICEs. You would expect that to then skew the shape of this curve so that the peak is further to the left. Right? So if you can lower the cost of developing technologies, more technologies will be launched at a low threshold than would be otherwise. Right? That might actually improve consumer surplus.
So, Catherine says, thank you for the presentation. As you noted, there are different perspectives. Who should be deciding the perspective and the rule goals?
That's up to policymakers. That's certainly not up to me to do that. I don't know if that's answered the question. I don't think it's up to me. I can explore the implications of different perspectives, or different objectives, but that's certainly not up to me to decide. That's I would say that in the case of the PMPRB, for example, that's the federal government that decides the policy there.
Yeah. Mechanism for them to understand the implications they make.
Yeah.
Then we have Julian Nam asking, how does competition enter into this framework?
That's an interesting question. So we've assumed in this model that suppliers are protected from price competition through the patent system. So while there is a patent in place, another firm cannot launch that product at a lower price. So that allows firms to price up to the threshold and get that supernormal profit. There's an interesting dynamic element here, which is that eventually that patent protection will expire. There may be other barriers to entry that prevent competition, but let's say there aren't. Let's say that at that point, new entrants come in, and that lowers the price. Firms are no longer able to price up to the threshold. In that case, you would expect less producer surplus for those manufacturers and more consumer surplus. But that's in the long term. So there's an important dynamic consideration here. If there is a desired share of the total surplus between consumers and producers, it's something to bear in mind that you might wish to have a lower proportion of consumer surplus in the short term, knowing that it will be slightly higher in the long term. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind, that you might expect competition to come in the future, so you want to consider that dynamic element. Yeah. Currently, the model in its present form is static. It's a conceptual model, and it doesn't consider those dynamic considerations.
Yeah. Can we think about working around patent policies that maximize consumer surplus plus producer surplus instead of focusing on reserve ISA, which is only known to producers?
Interesting question. So if you wish to maximize the combined surplus, that's certainly one of the policy options I've considered. Certainly, if we don't know what the reserve ISAs are, there's going to be an asymmetry of information there. We don't know what the reserve ISAs are. Firms have an incentive to overstate what they are, so that we don't, as a society, don't lower lambda too much, right? I don't know what the solution to that is. I think that's a complex question. I'll let Chris take over.
I think we can maybe gain some insights from the early years of NICE in the UK, where they considered themselves to be, rather than saying this is with relatively tight specification, this is the threshold we're working to, they considered themselves to be searching for the threshold, and so they were the response of industry to their decisions gave them information, and therefore. To a degree, as the payers, we don't need to worry about consumers, what the producer surplus is, unless it means that, and the reserve ISA is, unless it means that they don't bring their technologies to market at all. In repeated decisions, we should start to get some insight into what the reserve ISAs are for certain categories of technologies. So when we think about small molecule, there are some new technologies that are small molecules. Well, the manufacturing processes for small molecules are pretty stable. That is known how to be done and done very well. That is also increasingly true for biologics. We've been manufacturing those to high standards and reproducibility for 15 plus years now. We kind of know what their costs of goods are. If you think of a technology like a gene therapy or a CAR T therapy, how you manufacture those is completely novel. And therefore, it is almost certain that their reserves ISAs will be much higher because the experience to drive down their cost of goods isn't there. There isn't an industry built around the efficient manufacture of those technologies. And so we will probably be able to get insights into the true reserve ISAs of different categories of technology in a searching type mechanism. So I think we can move forward. We don't have to know their reserve ISA, but if companies want to make an argument that they are not getting a sufficient share of the surplus, that the producer surplus is too low, then they need to increase the transparency of their true costs of R&D and their true costs of goods manufacturing. And we see some legislators in different countries, there's some states in the US, who are giving serious consideration to legislating for disclosure of those costs, not just accepting what the companies say, but legislating for disclosure. So that's an interesting line. Tara, you wanted to ask a question. I think historically we've been very reluctant in all developed healthcare systems to say no. I would observe that what happens is really quite strategic and substantive price discount negotiations, which essentially is the same as applying a lower lander. And it is also not in the industry's interests to be seen withholding effective therapies from a population. I find the experience of Greece in the financial crisis that they had, where they couldn't pay for their drugs, and I think it was 2011, a couple of companies attempted to stop supplying, but the damage to their reputation was such that they recommenced supplying the drug. So it's not that political economy isn't only something that government and payers are subject to. It's actually something that the companies are often subject to as well. And so I think we can overplay the importance of, can we really have a negotiation? Don't they always hold all the cards? Well, no, they don't. And neither do we. And the negotiations happen and are important. So Susan says, many technologies have not made it into Canada because this consumer value is very low. Needs some sort of balance. This comes at the cost of quality of patient care. Everything comes at the cost of the quality of patient care. The difference is about the identifiability of the patients. Those patients who would lose when the consumer surplus curve, consumer threshold curve drops below 0, we don't know who they are, but we do know they lose, and that's loss in quality of care and healthcare outcomes to those patients. Does the identifiability of the patients who benefit when the consumer threshold curve is positive, are they the ones who should have a special value just because we know who they are? I mean, that's a really important ethical question. But everything that consumes resources has a cost somewhere else to somebody else's care. So I think we've exhausted the questions. I'd just like to invite everyone to express their appreciation for Mike's fantastic work. And thank you, Mike, for sharing it with us for the seminar today. It's been excellent. Thank you for the people online. It's been great to have you with us, and please, keep an eye out for the next NOAHE seminar. And if you have any further comments, please don't hesitate to email us them, and we'll pass them on to Mike. Have a good afternoon.